this study will be going through Judges chapter 7, 1 through 8.
Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The word Harod means trembling. And we don't know if this refers to verse 3. If you're too afraid, you can go back, and they left. Or it refers to verse 21, where the enemy, the Midianites, were running away, scared of Gideon and his army, and they ran and passed through this spring of Harod. It could be either one, but that's what this word means. And then we also want to notice that Gideon rose early. Gideon was a man with a plan, and it was almost as if he was afraid to lose time by sleeping. He was so prepared and so ready to go that the morning couldn't come soon enough. I ask myself, am I approaching my day like that? Am I ready for the day to where I am up early in the presence of God, carrying out the tasks that He has for me that day? Verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.' Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, 'Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead.' Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. The army was 32,000 men. Still too small in Gideon's mind to compete with this great Midianite horde of men that were encamped in the valley. And yet God says, no, that's too many. And so God stirred in Gideon in his heart to make this proclamation. And it's interesting because in chapter 5, we read that Deborah actually blamed those tribes, those men who didn't come out to fight. And here, the men are coming out to fight, and yet they're being sent home. Why is that? There's 3 reasons why. Number 1, God is showing that He doesn't need anybody to get the job done. God will not make Himself indebted to anyone for their service. Number 2, it's quickly made known who's a coward and who's going to stay and fight. The faint-hearted are not fit to fight in the army of God. 22,000 men left because Gideon said, if you're too afraid, you can go back. And 22,000 of them left. Instead of trusting that God was going before them, they look down over the valley and they see this vast army and they think, there is no way. And so again, the faint-hearted are not fit to fight in God's army. And number 3, God knows that a man's or a woman's heart is prideful. And we're tempted to boast in our own glories. Galatians 6:4 says that if we're going to boast, we boast in the cross. And we silence our flesh at the feet of Jesus and what He did for us at the cross. We boast in nothing else. And yet we are tempted as humans to get a pat on the back or to want that credit or to hear people say, good job, that was awesome, you did amazing. And God says, I know you're tempted to want that, to desire that, but I need you to see that it's me that's going before you, and so therefore I need to get the praise. Now in verse 3, Gideon makes a proclamation to the people, and he says if anyone is too afraid, he can turn back and go home. And so we know that God stirred it in Gideon's heart to make this announcement, to make this proclamation. I'm not sure if Gideon remembered that he could do this. In Deuteronomy 28, we read of a law that the kings or a general or commander could make to his people that said if you're too afraid, you can go back. And Gideon probably thought that this law was reserved for these kings and generals who were going to enlarge their territory, not necessarily for what he was going to do going up against an army to defend himself. And so God had to put it on his heart. Hey, don't forget that law. Remember, I've got that there for a reason. I want you to use it now. And so that's what he does. And again, 22,000 leave and 10,000 remain. And what this is showing to me is that Gideon is connected to the voice of God. Gideon is so in tune with God's Spirit that he hears this stirring in his heart. He feels it. And so he knows it's from God. This is the place we should all strive to be, connected and in tune with God's Spirit, when he stirs something, when he prompts something, we know that it's him speaking to us. Verse 4 says, "And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there." Let's stop right there because Gideon is probably remembering the battle that Barak had just a couple chapters before, and he had 10,000 fighting men. And so Gideon is looking at these 10,000 going, okay, I don't think 10,000 is enough, but God did it with Barak with 10,000. He can do it with me with 10,000. Okay, God, let's do this, 10,000. And God says, no, still too many. And Gideon is going, what in the world are you talking about? Like, there's no possible way that 10,000 is still too many. And God says, well, but it is. And I'm going to test them for you because clearly you're not seeing what I'm seeing yet. And it reminds me of Isaiah 55:9, where it says, God's thoughts and his ways are higher than ours. We don't have to understand why God does what he does. It's not our job to understand. We just have to trust. And with that trusting comes listening, being in tune with the Spirit. When God speaks, we answer. When God moves, we follow. And that's what God wants to teach Gideon here. So let's keep reading. Any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set him by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. Right here, God is separating these 10,000 men into two groups. Those who lap the water like a dog, and those who stick their head in the water like a horse. And let's talk about this for a second. Those who lapped like a dog, they were the ones that went down to the water, maybe knelt down, but ultimately they're scooping up the water in their hand, they're bringing it to their face, and they're still watching everywhere while they drink the water out of their hand. And they might have had to do this a couple times, scooping down the water, picking it up, drinking, but they're always looking around. They're always alert. They're always watching. They know what's happening around them because their eyes are up. They're looking around. They're drinking their water, but their eyes are watching. They are staying alert. The second group of people are those who kneel down at the water, stick their whole faces into the water, and drink like a horse. And although this way might have been more efficient to get more water, strategically, as a soldier, this was not efficient. Because while their heads are in the water, they are now vulnerable to any attacks that are coming behind them or beside them. Their heads are stuck in the water. They're not seeing anything going on. And this is foolish. And God separates these groups. And 300 lap like a dog, and 9,700 drank like a horse. So Gideon's looking and he's seeing these two groups being separated, and he's thinking, I really hope it's the 9,700 because he wants the numbers, right? And God says, there's the alert ones. There are the elite ones. Those are the ones that know what's going on. They've got their eyes up, their heads up. They know what's happening all around them. These guys, foolish. They were not wise. And just in that little test of drinking water, God separated Gideon's army once more. And I want us to remember that God can and does often bring about victory with small numbers, doesn't he? He uses weak people. That's what God does best. But this is the only time that God specifically, purposefully reduces an army or a group of people and made them fewer. Verse 7. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. If these 300 men had any servants or any extra bags or anything like that, it was sent back with the 9,700 men. All they took were provisions and a trumpet. Now, if there were any of the 300 who didn't have a trumpet, part of the group, the 9,700 who left, they were ordered to leave their trumpets. And this was to ensure that every man of that group of 300 had a trumpet in his possession. They don't know why. We're going to find out in our next study. But let's take a look at what these provisions and the trumpet represent. Now, the provisions here were something that they could carry with one hand. They could take nothing extra, only what they needed. And this was a test of two things. It was a test of their faith first. Were they going to trust God when they had nothing extra, when they had to rely on God only? And second, it was a test of their diligence or their obedience. God had commanded them, don't take anything extra. Just take what you need right now. We find out later that it's a jar with a torch in it. That's going to be in a later study. They aren't quite sure why they can't take anything extra, and they don't have a weapon. And this was a test of their obedience, because are they going to try to carry more than they need, even though God said not to, or are they going to obey and only take what God is telling them to take? And we're often tested like this as well, in our faith and in our obedience. Do we trust God when we have nothing else? And it's a test of our obedience. Are we trusting God to give us what we need? Are we trusting God to protect us, to provide for us, and to prove to us His goodness? I believe that God constantly is proving Himself to us. Now, whether or not we recognize that, whether or not we see that, that's a different story. But God is willing to protect. God is willing to provide. And He's willing to prove Himself to us, but we have to first have faith in who He says He is, and we have to obey. It reminds me of that story in Exodus when the Israelites have escaped from Egypt and they're wandering in the desert, and now they're feeling hungry. They're crying out to Moses, give us some food. We need food. And so Moses goes before God and he says, the people are hungry. And what does God do? He sends manna from heaven, and it lays on the desert floor. The people are commanded, go out in the morning, gather what you need, but only for you and your household and only for that day. Don't take enough for tomorrow. Don't gather enough for the week. Just get what you need for today. And although most people obeyed, there were some who hoarded. There were those who tried to gather up, fill up bags of manna and take it back. Well, what happens in the morning when they open their bags of manna that they got the day before? It was rotten. It was full of worms. God says, I've commanded you to only get what you need for today. Trust me that I'm going to send you more tomorrow. Trust that I'm going to provide for you tomorrow. Don't worry about it. Tomorrow has enough worry of its own. Just take care of today. We get really caught up with the worries of the day. And I start thinking about tomorrow and next week and what's going to happen next month. And God says, just worry about today. Let's get through today. Let's get through today. And tomorrow, we'll deal with that when it comes. We also see here in verse 8 that every man has a trumpet. They are told to use a trumpet rather than a weapon. This seems like unlikely battle gear. And yet, once again, just to drive this home as we finish this study, God's ways and God's thoughts are higher than ours. We can't even begin to understand the ways and the thoughts of God. And yet God says, you're not supposed to understand. You're not supposed to know. All you have to do is trust. Our job isn't to understand God's ways. It's just to trust in Him. And right here, Gideon's 300 men and Gideon himself are having to learn what it means to take a trumpet and one provision in your hand and trust that God is going to give you victory because He told you that He would. Are we trusting God to come through for us, to fight with us, to fight for us? This is the place we want to be in. Fully trusting, fully obeying, believing with our whole heart that God's ways are better than ours. That's a good place to be.